Hello, everyone. We want to welcome you to the last event in our Black Excellence in Pharmacy series, Enduring Desegregation at the Eshelman School of Pharmacy. I speak for myself, Tatiana, and Sissy when I say it has been the committee's pleasure to celebrate Black History Month through engaging and thought-provoking events. Today's event will be no different. And during today's event, we will be hearing from three speakers, Dr. Bond, Christian Brown, and Dr. Urick. So we're going to get started with an introduction of each one of our speakers, and then we're going to pass it over to Dr. Bond for the presentation. So Dr. Gregory Bond is the Assistant Director and the Head Archivist at the American Institute of the History of Pharmacy, which is located at the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Pharmacy. He also serves as a Senior Editor of History of Pharmacy and Pharmaceuticals, AIHP's academic journal. His research interests include the history of African American pharmacy education and the history of African American pharmacy practice. Today, his presentation will explore the history of the desegregation of pharmacy education in the United States South during the 20th century. We also have Christian Brown. She's a PharmD candidate, class of 2023 at the UNC Eshelman School of Pharmacy. She pursues pharmacy history as a hobby to improve her understanding of the trajectory of her future profession. Her clinical interests include deprescribing, polypharmacy, and geriatrics. And last, we'll have Dr. Ben Urick. He's an assistant professor in the Center for Medication Optimization at the UNC Eshelman School of Pharmacy. A historical hobbyist, he is particularly interested in changes to pharmacy practice and education during the 1950s and 1960s. His primary research focuses on the impact of pharmacy services on healthcare value and statistical methods for provider profiling. So throughout the event, the chat will be monitored for questions. Feel free to list any questions you may have in the chat to be answered at the end of the session. So now I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Bond.
All right, thanks, Jasmine, for that introduction. Everything look good and sound good so far for everyone? Excellent. Thanks again to Jasmine and Sissy and everyone else for organizing this very interesting series of talks. Thanks for me for all the organizational help throughout the process of putting this together. And really thanks to Ben and Christian for including me in this series and for including me in this very interesting project they're working on about the desegregation of the UNC School of Pharmacy. I really appreciate them including me. Before I begin, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the vocabulary in this lecture. During the course of this talk, I'll present some historical quotations that use the now outdated words of Negro or colored. I've maintained these words only when they appear in exact quotations for the sake of historical accuracy. In 1948, in an essay for the Pharmaceutical Survey, a comprehensive study of American pharmacy sponsored by the American Council on Education, Chauncey Cooper, the dean of the Howard University School of Pharmacy, critiqued the state of pharmacy education in the US South. He wrote, quote, "Racial discrimination should be foreign and objectionable in schools of pharmacy in the future. The states in the segregated system of education should begin at once to provide ways and means of furnishing equal opportunities in pharmacy to their Negro citizens who, though fully qualified, are denied admission to their own state colleges because of color." So we see here in 1948, the state of pharmacy education in 1948. 18 states and the District of Columbia, seen here in red, supported racially segregated systems of public higher education in accordance with the Supreme Court's infamous 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which ruled that separate but equal accommodations for African Americans were constitutional. At the same time, these southern states supported 0 publicly funded African American colleges of pharmacy. The South's only 2 schools of pharmacy which admitted African American students were 2 private historically Black colleges and universities, Howard University in DC and Xavier University in New Orleans. In 1948, on the other hand, there were 23 white segregated schools of pharmacy in the South, which by either state law or customary practice did not admit African Americans. There were 17 public schools of pharmacy across 14 states and 6 private schools of pharmacy in the region. The battle against the color line in Southern pharmacy education, however, did not begin in 1948 with Chauncey Cooper's essay in the Pharmaceutical Survey. As early as 1933, Thomas Raymond Hocutt, a 24-year-old graduate of the North Carolina College for Negroes, now known as North Carolina Central University, applied to the University of North Carolina School of Pharmacy. UNC, however, summarily rejected his application solely because he was African American. In response, Hokut immediately sued the school for admission. Hokut's lawsuit was supported by the Legal Defense Fund of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, marking the NAACP's first legal attack in the country against segregated higher education. In preparing for this lawsuit, Franklin Porter Graham, the president of the University of North Carolina, wrote to the Attorney General of North Carolina that, quote, "I wish the point might be conceded for purposes of this litigation that the young colored man who is bringing the suit is eligible to enter the university and the School of Pharmacy and would be otherwise qualified were it not for the public policy relating to his race." In a testament to the very complicated nature of race relations in the 1930s, though, James Edward Shepard, the president of the North Carolina College for Negroes and one of North Carolina's most powerful African Americans, did not support Hokut's lawsuit. Shepard did not want to anger the white political power structure in the state, and he instead proposed adding professional education to his segregated all-Black campus by, quote, amending the charter of the North Carolina College for Negroes so as to empower the Board of Trustees to establish departments of pharmacy, law, and medicine when in their judgment it was best to do so. In the end, Shepard's opposition killed the lawsuit. He refused to release Hokut's academic transcript from his college to the trial court, which allowed the judge to rule on a technicality that Hokut could not establish his academic credentials. 3 years later, in 1936, the NAACP took another legal shot. William B. Redmond II, a 27-year-old graduate of historically Black Tennessee A&I University, applied for admission to the University of Tennessee College of Pharmacy. After the College of Pharmacy rejected his application, the NAACP again helped Redmond sue the university. Not surprisingly, though, the Tennessee State Supreme Court eventually ruled that Redmond's inability to attend the segregated all-white University of Tennessee College of Pharmacy somehow did not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the United States, and therefore that the college's color line was constitutional. I think it's very hard for us today to appreciate the courage of people like Thomas Hokut and William Redmond, who very publicly challenged the Jim Crow laws and the entrenched white power structure of their local communities. Contemporary observers, though, very much appreciated their bravery. In 1933, the Carolina Times, a local Black newspaper, wrote about the Hokut trial, quote, "This publication leads in applauding the courage of Thomas R. Hokut, the student who applied to the University of North Carolina School of Pharmacy. Writing of Hokut and his lawyers, the newspaper said, even our worst enemies admired their courage." 2 years later, the New York Age, a national Black newspaper, also praised William Redmond, writing, quote, "It takes a great deal of courage for Negro students in the South to fight to open the barriers thrown against them by prejudiced school officials and tradition. But these United States," the paper wrote, "were built by pioneers who faced unknown dangers with the necessary courage. The pioneering spirit of our Negro youth who are fighting these school discriminations is what we have long needed. With it, we as a race should go a long way." Although they failed, one very important consequence of the Hokut and Redmond lawsuits was that they finally encouraged most Southern states to begin thinking about making some educational opportunities available to African American professional and graduate students. One tactic eventually adopted throughout the South was the awarding of scholarships to out-of-state schools or to historically Black colleges and universities for African American residents who wished to pursue professional degrees like pharmacy. Both Tennessee and North Carolina, as we see here, adopted such out-of-state scholarship programs in the aftermath of the lawsuits against their schools of pharmacy. And states around the South soon adopted similar programs to fund the out-of-state education of Black professional and graduate students, including pharmacy students. As we see here in Texas in 1939, these programs could be very expensive, with Texas setting aside $500,000 for these out-of-state scholarships. Although many individual African-American professional students took advantage of these out-of-state scholarships for their education, the programs themselves remained very controversial. Howard's pharmacy dean, Chauncey Cooper, for example, criticized the practice in his 1948 essay for the Pharmaceutical Survey, writing, quote, "At its best, this plan is a poor substitute for equal opportunity. It's an added burden to the taxpayer. It is unnecessarily expensive to the recipient of such assistance. And at present, when all institutions are crowded and first priority is given to the native resident of the state, it is meaningless." After World War II, activists kept up the pressure. In 1948 and 1949, Martin Booth and Richard Tyson, both of Baltimore, sued to gain admission to the University of Maryland College of Pharmacy. The university and the College of Pharmacy stalled and delayed for 2 years. And in 1950, the Baltimore Afro-American complained, quote, "Every possible subterfuge under the sun has been used by the university to prevent the enrollment of colored students, despite the fact that the university gets support from all taxpayers, regardless of race, creed, or color." When the university instead proposed scholarships to Xavier School of Pharmacy, both plaintiffs rejected the idea. Richard Tyson explained, quote, "I think this is a dirty deal. The people of Maryland should do something about it because it is very undemocratic. I realize that Xavier is an excellent school, but I'd rather go to the University of Maryland, and my lawsuit will continue." In the end, the university succeeded with its delays, and neither Booth nor Tyson ever attended Maryland's School of Pharmacy. Throughout the 30s and 40s, the NAACP continued to specifically target segregated graduate and professional education. And as we see here, the organization eventually won a series of important legal victories at the United States Supreme Court to open many of these schools to African American students. For our purposes today, the most important of these cases was 1950's Sweat versus Painter, which ruled that separate but equal professional and graduate schools were unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and the Supreme Court mandated that the University of Texas Law School admit African-American plaintiff Herman Sweat. The Supreme Court ruled that, quote, "The petitioner, Herman Sweat, may claim his full constitutional rights, legal education equivalent to that offered by the state to students of other races. Such education is not available to him in a separate law school offered by the state." After the Painter and other Supreme Court decisions, it became increasingly difficult and, importantly, increasingly expensive for Southern states to defend a separate but equal higher education. And the states of the Upper South finally began to drop their educational color lines and to allow African Americans to attend formerly all-white public colleges and universities. By 1954, schools of pharmacy, both public and private, in several states had dropped their racial restrictions and enrolled African American students. The University of Maryland, for example, finally desegregated in 1951, and the School of Pharmacy admitted its first Black student. The St. Louis College of Pharmacy, a private school, dropped its color bar in 1952 after a 4-year local protest campaign by Black pharmacists in St. Louis. The University of Texas College of Pharmacy adopted a half measure to only strictly comply with the exact letter of the Sweat versus Painter decision, enrolling African American pharmacy graduate students, but continuing to bar Black undergraduates from the University of Texas and the College of Pharmacy there. So we see here the state of pharmacy education in the South in 1954. In the states in green, pharmacy schools in 7 states and the District of Columbia had completely dropped their color lines and enrolled African Americans. But 8 states in the Deep South, including North Carolina, continued to resist desegregation and to maintain strictly segregated pharmacy schools and mostly segregated systems of higher education. And Texas, of course, was the weird case by admitting graduate students to the School of Pharmacy, but not undergraduates. Despite the ruling in Sweat versus Painter in 1950, the states of Florida and Texas continued to try to build separate but equal segregated educational systems that could pass constitutional muster. In terms of pharmacy, the Texas legislature created a College of Pharmacy in 1949 at Texas State University for Negroes, now Texas Southern University. And in 1951, the Florida legislature established the College of Pharmacy at Florida A&M University, the state's public segregated Black university. In establishing the Texas State College for Negroes in 1947, the Texas legislature made its intentions very clear. writing in the enabling legislation that, quote, upon demand being made for any course of instruction offered at the University of Texas, such course shall then be established or added to the curriculum at the Texas State College for Negroes. These plans to avoid desegregation at all costs and to maintain all white universities as much as possible did not fool many people. And the Black press, while careful not to criticize the teachers or students at these schools, routinely derided what they called these Jim Crow universities. From 1933 until 1954, academic pharmacists, including the American Association of Colleges of Pharmacy, took very little notice of these legal battles over pharmacy education. In 1954, however, some AACP members, led by Dean Chauncey Cooper at Howard University College of Pharmacy, protested the continued institutional membership of racially segregated schools or colleges of pharmacy. Linwood Tice, the dean of the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy and the president then of AACP, defended the organization's inclusion of all white or all Black pharmacy schools, saying that when such schools met the organization's membership qualifications, they could not be excluded. He did allow, however, quote, that the members of the executive committee wish to state clearly their position on the principle of separate but equal facilities for the education of Negroes. This practice, Dean Tice said, is not only unconstitutional by the decision of the United States Supreme Court, but also a violation of the human rights and the dignity of man. Dean Cooper, who was then an AACP vice president, criticized what he saw as the very empty rhetoric of AACP. He proposed instead a new membership policy for the organization to exclude any school which was by law all Black or all white, suggesting, quote, no school which follows a policy of excluding or segregating qualified applicants or students on the basis of race or color shall be qualified to be admitted to membership in the association. He blasted what he called AACP's, quote, policy of continued indifference to a program of discrimination. And he charged that, quote, the association's tolerance of segregation could and would be used as signifying approval and thus as a basis for the continuation of an immoral and illegal course of conduct. Despite Dean Cooper's strong protest, however, AACP and its members were not inclined to challenge the membership of powerful all-white Southern schools of pharmacy like the University of North Carolina or the University of Florida. The organization and its membership declined to revisit the issue and took no further action on the question of segregated pharmacy education throughout the 50s and 60s. In response to the various Supreme Court decisions that attacked segregated education, many Southern states began a campaign of what they called massive resistance to construct as many obstacles as possible to impede and block the process of desegregation. We can see here an excellent example of this massive resistance in regard to the University of Florida College of Pharmacy and plaintiff Rose Boyd. Boyd wanted to study pharmacy, and she was one of 5 students who sued the University of Florida for admission in 1949. Over the next 7 years, as we see here, the university and the College of Pharmacy, with the assistance of Florida state courts, delayed and stalled and successfully fought the plaintiffs to a standstill. Finally, in 1957, the University of Florida Law School admitted the university's first Black student, but the College of Pharmacy remained all white until 1963, 14 years after Rose Boyd, who never attended the University of Florida, initially filed her lawsuit. After the Civil Rights Act of 1964 strengthened laws against school segregation, and the federal government finally proved willing to actively force the desegregation of all white schools, the remaining segregated Southern college universities, including their pharmacy schools, began to eliminate their racial barriers. Starting at UNC in 1962, and then in 1963 at the private Mercer College and at the University of Florida College of Pharmacy, and then continuing over the next several years, schools and colleges of pharmacies around the South finally enrolled African-American students. I'd like to take special note here of 2 of these trailblazing students. Mona Yvonne Boston, who we're going to hear a lot about in a few minutes, was the first African-American graduate of the University of North Carolina School of Pharmacy in 1967, 34 years after the application of Thomas Hocutt in 1933. Sharon Ann New was one of the two first African-American graduates of the University of Tennessee School of Pharmacy in 1973, 37 years after the application of William B. Redmond in 1936. Now, I think it's important to clarify here the distinction between desegregation and integration. Desegregation is merely the removal of legal and racial barriers that allowed the presence of African Americans on campus. Integration, on the other hand, is a more proactive and comprehensive effort to change the nature of an institution and to provide for the full inclusion and equal participation of all students, including African Americans. Most Southern schools of pharmacy only did as little as possible and simply desegregated by dropping their color barriers. Most schools and colleges of pharmacy in the South made little effort to change their traditional practices or to make their schools more inclusive and more welcoming to non-white students. We can see here, for example, how the bare minimum of simple desegregation led to a very, very slow pace of African-American matriculation at many Southern schools of pharmacy. West Virginia University School of Pharmacy, for example, desegregates in 1953, but did not graduate its first African-American student until 1969. Auburn University School of Pharmacy desegregates in 1964, but didn't graduate its second African-American student until 10 years later in 1974. The Medical College of South Carolina School of Pharmacy desegregates in 1967, but did not graduate its first 3 female African-American students until 1980. One important exception to this rule was the private Mercer University Southern School of Pharmacy in Atlanta. As one historian has explained, quote, while other schools waited for Black students to apply and then often screened out as many as they could, Mercer administrators were on the roads and in the air actively recruiting. All of that was no secret to the guidance counselors in the Black high schools, and they skillfully steered their best students to Mercer, a school that was not only anxious to enroll them, but offered attractive scholarships. Mercer's pharmacy dean, Oliver Littlejohn, was also actively encouraging the enrollment of African Americans. Between 1965 and 1971, Mercer's Southern School of Pharmacy enrolled at least 20 African American students and graduated at least 11 African Americans in those 6 years, far outpacing its peer institutions across the South. Now, unfortunately, as we can probably easily imagine, the experiences of many of these first generation of African American students at most formerly all-white institutions was very unpleasant. As historian Rachel Devlin has explained in her fantastic book, A Girl Stands at the Door, quote, the small number of firsts who arrived in the 1960s met constant verbal harassment and sometimes violence. But there was one aspect of the school desegregation process that all pioneers agreed upon in both the North and the South, that social isolation was the most painful aspect of their experience in formerly all-white schools. Here we're hearing an example of this type of social isolation from William Roby III, the class of 1970 at the University of Georgia and the University of Georgia College of Pharmacy's first African-American graduate. In this interview, he discusses his arrival on campus, and he's explained how he just met and had a very friendly chat with a white pharmacy student on his first day in the dorms at Georgia.
I see this guy and I said, oh God, this is the guy I met, in the room, and so, I'm just beaming like, okay, I'm getting ready to say hello, and he's getting ready to maybe introduce me or just at least acknowledge me or whatever. Okay. He kind of, and I guess he was real tired, shy, or timid or whatever, but he and his buddies, they kind of looked. When he saw me, he glanced and looked away. And all the guys, the 2 guys with him, looked away. Okay. And they walked past me, looking down at the sidewalk past me. Okay. That day, my life changed.
Unfortunately, many early African-American students at formerly all-white institutions faced such slights on a daily basis and sometimes encountered more overt opposition or harassment. I know I'm running short on time, so I'd like to quickly close by noting the nearly complete lack of historical memory about the desegregation of pharmacy education in the South. These would-be pharmacy students here, William Hocutt, William Redmond, Martin Booth, Rose Boyd, and Richard Tyson, are almost completely forgotten from the historical literature. And unfortunately, they've also been forgotten, as we see here in the case of Thomas Hocutt at the UNC School of Pharmacy, at the formerly all-white institutions that drew the color line against them in the mid-20th century. And I see I had William Raymond instead of Thomas Raymond Hocutt on the left there. I apologize for that. I don't mean to pick on or single out the UNC School of Pharmacy here. These other schools of pharmacy, Tennessee, Maryland, and Florida, have also not done anything to commemorate these legal battles against their color lines. I think in order to better understand the past, present, and the future of diversity and inclusion at schools of pharmacy, we need to do a much better job of recognizing and studying this history about the desegregation of colleges of pharmacy and the stories of these African-American students who battled against and broke the color line in Southern pharmacy education, like the largely unheralded pioneers seen on this screen. What can their experiences, for example, teach us about how to improve pharmacy education today? How should we remember and teach these difficult histories to current students? We should also study and better understand the white academic pharmacists at schools and colleges of pharmacy around the country, both North and South, and organizations like the American Association of Colleges of Pharmacy, who declined to publicly take action against the color line and demonstrated, in the words of Howard's Dean Chauncey Cooper, a persistent, quote, policy of continued indifference to a program of discrimination. Perhaps better understanding these choices and decisions can help contemporary and future pharmacy students, pharmacy educators, and pharmacy organizations better confront and respond to these types of difficult and complicated ethical questions in the years to come. Thanks for listening.
Okay, Greg, thank you very much for that presentation. You know, it was at the International Congress for the History of Pharmacy, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, in 2019 that I had a chance to see Greg's presentation, and I thought, you know, we can change this. We can reveal these histories. This is not that long ago. And so it was that idea, and I brought it back to the school and found Christian Brown, who's a P2 student who's been a delight to work with on this project, and also with the support of our advancement office and the dean level. We've gone out and conducted what we were calling the UNC School of Pharmacy Oral History Project, or Desegregation, Oral History Desegregation Project. And so that's what this next presentation is on. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And with the sound, perfect. Okay. So with that, I'd like to talk about Black excellence enduring desegregation at the UNC School of Pharmacy. So here's the overview. We'll talk about both segregation and desegregation in North Carolina to frame out what the environment was like before these students came to UNC and what they were facing when they did take these steps to desegregate the School of Pharmacy. Then talk about desegregation at UNC Chapel Hill more broadly, and then finish things out with desegregation at the UNC School of Pharmacy. So first, to talk about white supremacy and Jim Crow in North Carolina. So, you know, I admit, as someone who grew up in the upper Midwest, you know, in a farming community, on a farm, that, you know, this history was something I certainly learned about in school, probably in February, but was not a part of my growing up. And so it's really been through this exploration process that I have come to sort of understand at a deeper level exactly what things were like under the white supremacy regime that was the Jim Crow South. And it is not extreme to say that. So, you know, one thing that has been in the news a little bit is the Wilmington insurrection of 1898. This is the only successful insurrection on North American soil, and it occurred in Wilmington, North Carolina. What had happened was, after Reconstruction, there was a coalition of the white working poor and Black people in North Carolina that created what they called a fusionist government. And they were actually able to elect a governor in 1896. And the white elites looked at that rising Black power and said, absolutely not. The red shirts, which were part of the Democratic Party at the time, actually went to Wilmington after a successful election of an integrated government, murdered many black men, burned down the only black newspaper in town, as you can see here, and took over the government and kicked out the previous integrated government. And this moment created in North Carolina a democratic regime that lasted, the democratic regime that implemented white supremacy, Jim Crow laws, eliminated the black vote, and I'll show you some things that came out of the Raleigh News and Observer. This was what they were pushing out as the state of what they called, and again, to use terms from the time, Negro rule, and warring against it. So it's the honest white man beating down Negro rule in this horrible comic that was a political cartoon that was in the Raleigh News and Observer, the largest newspaper at the time. And this picture is even more shocking of the threat that was seen at the time of this Negro rule and the need to suppress black people in North Carolina and implement this white supremacist regime that was of course segregation, also disenfranchisement, the elimination of the black vote, and including lynchings. There were 59 people. There were 59 black people killed in North Carolina between 1898 and the end of the 1940s. So, you know, it's not just pictures like this for segregation, it's the entire environment in the South that not only our applicants, but really, you know, also their parents' generations were facing when these students chose to enroll or attempt to enroll in the UNC School of Pharmacy. Of course, that picture from Durham. Here's another picture with a segregated white and colored door, 1940 in segregated Durham. So, you know, that was the Jim Crow South and the white supremacy regime that was. And of course, as we start to get into the 1960s, the civil rights movement picks up steam. And we see, for example, in 1957, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools were desegregated. This is our own Ruby Bridges here, Dorothy Counts, desegregating that school. And she is surrounded by what I believe is a mob of her classmates, heckling her as she simply went to school in 1957. Fast forward to 1960, the sit-in movement across the South. That peaceful protest started in Greensboro with the Greensboro Four, seen here. These students were in high school. It took this bold step to take a peaceful move towards civil rights. And we in Chapel Hill, as you may be aware of, have the Chapel Hill Nine. They followed weeks after the Greensboro Four and did a sit-in, and actually it was at a drugstore here in Chapel Hill, Colonial Drugstore. So very similar to the Woolworth sit-ins. And then there was an active civil rights movement in North Carolina. This is outside of Longmeadow Dairy Store, 63, College Cafe in 63. And then actually this is a picture of Colonial Drugstore in 1963 with a version of a sit-in, as you can see here. So, you know, that was the environment in Chapel Hill. Other parts of the state were much more overt in their support for this previous white supremacist regime. This is this is 1964, and these are people, of course, dressed in full KKK regalia, walking down the street with a smile on their face in Salisbury, North Carolina, just south of here, and you know, locking eyes with two black gentlemen who are passing them on the street. So that was the environment in North Carolina leading up to desegregation at UNC and desegregation at the School of Pharmacy. Turn things over to Christian to talk about desegregating UNC.
Yes, so desegregation in UNC started at the law school. The NAACP finally won a suit against Carolina law in March of 1951. You can go to the next slide. That permitted Black students to enter the following summer. And these gentlemen entered the Carolina Law School. Their names were Harvey Beach, James Lassiter, Floyd McKissick, and Kenneth Lee. Next slide. The med school also officially desegregated in the same year, 1951. And we have here the first Black medical student. He is Dr. Oscar Diggs in his academic regalia, and he is sitting next to the second Black med student here at UNC, Dr. James Slade, who matriculated the following year in 1952. And big UNC finally admitted its first Black undergrads in 1955 from a Durham County high school, and their names were Ralph and Leroy Frazier and John Brandon. And in this time, the largest African-American enrollment at UNC was only about 0.3% out of up to 7,500 undergrads. Blacks were, as Dr. Bond was telling us, they were allowed to attend. They were certainly not welcome, which is, again, the difference between desegregation and integration. And it's still the difference between diversity and inclusion. Next slide. So now we come to desegregating the UNC School of Pharmacy. And this is a picture of brand new Beard Hall built in 1959. And you can see the tiny bushes out front. The racial, next slide. This graph takes our list of about 10,000 alumni at the UNC School of Pharmacy, and it shows our ethnic diversification over time. And you can see here in gray that our school is incredibly white, and it still is. The marked increase in diversification that you see starting in the 80s, mostly with Asian identifying students, is due to direct efforts by our first non-white dean, who was a Japanese American pharmacist by the name of Tom Mia. And his task force actually wrote the school's first strategic plan entitled Planning for Excellence. And this graph provides a visual representation of the progress toward one of our current strategic plan goals to recruit and retain diverse talent. And so in terms of Black talent, these pharmacists were our firsts. The first one, you'll learn about William Wicker, and the second, Mona Boston Reddick today. And we plan to interview Jimmy Barnes next month. But also of note, our sixth graduate on here, Dr. Noah Unsai Nswadi, he was an international student from the Congo. But first, we have Mr. William Wicker.
Thank you, Christian. So William Wicker, as seen here, this is his freshman year picture in the Yakety Yak, UNC's yearbook from the time. He enrolled in 1962, but to talk a little bit about his childhood and his experiences growing up. So he was born in South Carolina and raised by a single mother in North Carolina in Forsyth County, so just outside of Winston-Salem. He describes his upbringing as being in a poor, working class, segregated neighborhood with strong community support. He talks about how, of course, they didn't have air conditioning, so they could just leave the windows open at night, leave the front door open at night, and they felt secure in their neighborhood. There was no concerns about that. Very close ties with the church. The church was just down the street and could walk there, and a lot of people in the neighborhood looked after him and supported him when he was growing up. He attended a segregated school, as was, of course, the case in North Carolina at that time under Jim Crow and segregation. He got a start, though, in pharmacy by working at a Black-owned pharmacy in Winston-Salem under two Black pharmacists, one of whom had graduated from actually Shaw University. So Shaw University used to have a college of pharmacy associated with the Leonard Medical School, but was closed down in 1918 as a result of the Flexner Report, which closed down many historically Black medical colleges, and actually with that then closed many historically Black pharmacy schools as well. And so once those pharmacy schools were closed, training opportunities for Black pharmacists were limited to those two that Dr. Bond had mentioned, Xavier and Howard. And so to hear him talk about his upbringing, when he was looking to enroll in the pharmacy school, he had been accepted at Howard University and thought that he would apply to UNC, get rejected from UNC, and that would make him eligible for one of these scholarships that Dr. Bond had talked about. And it was partially the result of the Hokut case back in 1933. But he was accepted. And so he thought at the end of it, in this quote, he says, and so it was goodbye to Howard and hello, Carolina. So when he arrived on campus, Dr. Bond talked about in many ways the social isolation, and that is, I think, the strongest thing to describe with Mr. Wicker's experience it was very, very isolating. And you can see that with the first quote and the second quotes. As a part of the second quote, he says it felt like there was a spotlight shining in a crowd, and you were just there in that crowd, in that spotlight, and that's kind of the way that it was. And in addition to that isolation, he faced active opposition from the administration at the pharmacy school. Dr. Chambers, who was the assistant dean, which was the #2 dean, there were slightly fewer deans at that time than there are currently in the School of Pharmacy, so he was the #2 dean, and Mr. Wicker recalls Dr. Chambers telling his employer, Winston, that he would never graduate from the School of Pharmacy at Chapel Hill. And so to hear that in his own words,
school at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill without anything. My parents, my mother had an 8th grade education. She could not help me with anything. She thought that they played football inside before the Astrodome was built. And not anybody in my family ever set foot on the college campus, had no ideas about what it was like and what I was going through. When I left to go to school, my aunt gave me $25. That was bus fare and some other things, but that was about the extent of it, because they had no idea what I was getting into or what I went through the entire time I was there. So there was nobody to support my family that could tell me or give me any advice or anything. So I was all alone, just facing all of this, trying to survive. But I was determined that I was not going to be turned around. The interaction with the other students at the pharmacy program was just like we sat in the same classroom. When the class was over, everybody went separate directions and they act like they didn't see you. You were just kind of there. I tell a story about, I went to CLW tournament. And you guys probably don't know what CLW tournament is, but it's a black college tournament, and a basketball tournament. And I had a bet with one of my friends about the game and the outcome. And so I lost the bet. So the bet was that if my hair was longer than his, and so I had a big afro. And so part of the bet was that I would cut my hair. So he shaved my head after the tournament. I went back to pharmacy school, and they thought they had a new student for 2 weeks. And these guys told me later, said, we didn't know who this person was, the new student that we had in our class. And so we finally figured out it was you after 2 weeks. And so, I mean, we had been in class for like, maybe that time, about 2 years, every day in and out. So that's how much attention they paid to me and to the rest. And the instructors were the same way. I went to school at University of North.
And here's another clip.
I had a fellow tell me that one of my classmates tell me, and we actually worked together later at this CVS store. He told me, he said, you're sitting, every time I see you, I think you're sitting in a white kid's seat. And I said, no, I said, I earned my seat. I said, I qualify for the seat and I belong in this seat. Now, your friend may not be here, but I'm not the reason he's not here. Because they probably looked at both of us and decided which was coming, which was not. And the fact that I came in as a white student, I didn't come in as a black student. They didn't know I was black till I got down there, that they could open all the things with me. So I qualified to sit in this seat. But he later became one of my very good friends. Attitude changed as because he had not known anybody up close and personal black before, and so his attitude changed. But that's what he told me, that I was sitting in a white kid's seat. I had a fellow tell me that.
So you can get the sense there from Mr. Wicker how isolating it was, his interaction with other students, and this sense of isolation and the stress of pharmacy school, and the environment that he was surrounded by at that time. Think back to what was happening when he was in pharmacy school. 62 was when he was enrolled. 63, 64 active protests in Chapel Hill. He was not a part of those protests because he was focused on his studies, and the studies became so stressful for him that he did finally make the decision to drop out of pharmacy school. But he always thought that he was going to come back. It was always his intention. He saw it as a break and not him leaving the school. And in 1970, he did re-enroll. he accomplished that goal. And when he came back in 1970, he found it to be much more supportive, much less cold. There was a new dean on campus and many new faculty members from the north. I don't see Stephen Eckel on here, but Fred Eckel was actually one of those new faculty members from the north, from Ohio, that came down, and didn't get anything specific from Mr. Wicker about that. But Jimmy Barnes, who we are interviewing next month, he talks about in his recollections that are stored with the Southern Oral History Project that it was actually Fred Eckel in particular who supported him and made the environment more welcoming. So these new faculty members from the north really did make a difference. And here's a bit of that experience in his own words.
It was 100% transition in the process. As I told you earlier, the structure at the pharmacy school, Dean Breck and Dean Chambers were there when I came in. They were prototypical Southern aristocracy, so to speak. Aristocracy might be a bad word, but they were just, it was apparent that they didn't want me in the school from day one. And the whole attitude, the whole everything was totally different. A lot of younger professors came in. A lot of professors came in from north, from other places where they had not experienced those kinds of behaviors. It was a whole. I think the state knew, the pharmacists knew, the pharmacy board knew that we needed changes, and they just decided they wanted to be the top program in the country, not just a North Carolina program. It was just closed. I mean, pharmacy was closed in North Carolina, when I went, and the whole change about the school, the whole attitude, everything were totally different. There were younger professors that were, openly and encouraged us, that just wasn't there when I went there at first. I mean, it was worse. It was worse in the pharmacy school in place also, that I encountered on campus at that time. It was just, they were just not ready, and I may not have been strong enough to fight the battle at that point. But as I guess I grew older and I'm just more determined to make it. It was, it seemed okay, but it was not there. It was not there. And just like I said, Chambers didn't know. Dr. Chambers did not know the person he was talking to about me. But he had no problems telling him he would never graduate from school of pharmacy at Chapel Hill. And I've had at least two other students who came in at the same time that I did, that people said the same thing about them. You would never graduate from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It wasn't so much that, not so much they thought we weren't going to make it, that they hoped we didn't make it. They just didn't want us there at the time. But and that was kind of in keeping with what was going on in the South at the time. It was a lot of turmoil, a lot of everything, and they weren't ready for change, and we had to face it. And it's unfortunate that we were put through the kind of stuff that we were put through at this stage. But like I said earlier, if I had to do it again, I'd probably do it again. I think I got more out of, than I lost in the process. And I know, I loved the school. I loved Chapel Hill. I did from the first day I set foot on campus. I never felt like I was making waves or blazing trails. I just wanted to go to school. I just wanted to go to school at Chapel Hill. And I really didn't, and the more I was associated with it, and the more I found out about it, the more I wanted to be there. And I always, every day, walked out of the dormitory as any other Tar Heel, headed to class and was smiling and happy and tried. It was just early. It was just a bad time, and maybe I was not strong enough to ready to fight that kind of war. And then I didn't go down there with the intentions of fighting a war or doing anything other than just to get an education and be a pharmacist.
And he remained engaged with the school after graduation and participated in some recruitment efforts. And we have one final clip from him to talk about some of those efforts.
Had a guy named Dr. George Kokolas. He taught inorganic pharmaceutical chemistry. And he was, this is later in my tenure there, was charged with recruiting Black students when the pharmacy school decided they wanted some Black students. At that point, only 14 had graduated in the history of the school. And so Dr. Kokolas had all this money for recruiting Black students. We thought that some of us would be allowed to go around the state and talk to some high school kids and try to get involved and get to bring some. They brought some kids. There were kids on campus from various parts of the state, and after a session, at one point, the kids came up, and one kid came up and wanted to talk to me. He said, "You know, I've never seen a Black pharmacist in my life," and so I mean, there were no role models in the eastern part of the state for the kids to follow. In Charlotte and Winston-Salem, Greensboro, there were pharmacists and pharmacies, but in the east, there was almost non-existent. There was one pharmacy down in Goldsboro, but so the kids had no role models, no idea that they could actually be pharmacists because they never seen one before. One kid came up from Greenville who had worked in a white pharmacy during his high school, doing odd jobs and stuff. And then so he came to pharmacy school, but he had never seen a Black pharmacist either. So to even think that kids think that they can't be pharmacists because pharmacists aren't Black, you know. And so I'm sure a lot of that happens today, even today, because it's not, for as many as that they are in Winston-Salem, Greensboro, Raleigh, Charlotte, in the other areas, there's still not many pharmacists as models for the future. Dr. Kokolas spent most of the money that he had allotted for recruiting, having us to dinner in Chapel Hill from time to time. And so that's how most of the money went. So we ended up still getting not many students. He was, Kokolas was Greek from Boston area. He told me that, he said, you know, I'm Greek and I have problems too, just like you. And I said, Dr. Kokolas, the difference between me and you is that they see you a block away and you're just another person. They see me a block away and I already decide how I'm going to be received before I get there. And I don't think the Greeks were ever treated the way Black folk were treated in America, but that was his attitude, that you guys really don't have any problems, you're your own problem and you're not doing enough to help yourself get along. So it's like putting a fox in charge of the hen house when you have somebody doing recruiting that don't really want to recruit. But those are some of the things that happened. Right.
So after graduation, he owned an independent pharmacy for 15 years back in Greensboro, sold that pharmacy to a chain store in the 1980s, actually filled in Salisbury, North Carolina, where the KKK picture was. Had an interaction where the KKK Grand Dragon actually came into the store while he was working. Technician knew him as that, and this is, you know, the KKK still exists. So the technician knew that and told this, you know, the Grand Dragons, don't start anything here today. Didn't, and had such a good experience working with the technicians that the technicians actually asked him to come back to Salisbury, North Carolina, to that environment, which was again just a different part of the state. You know, currently he's actually still working. So he's still working. The first black student to enroll in the UNC School of Pharmacy is still an actively working pharmacist. He's working at independent pharmacy in Greensboro, filling in there, and he's looking forward very much to giving the COVID vaccine. So with that, I'll turn things over to Christian to talk about the first Black graduate of the School of Pharmacy, Mona Boston Reddick.
Yes, our first Black graduate. She was born Mona Yvonne Boston in 1943. She grew up in Shawtown outside Willington, North Carolina, which is halfway between Raleigh and Fayetteville. Shawtown was actually the Black part of town just outside city limits. Both of her parents were college educated, and her family was central to the Lillington community. So next slide, Miss Reddick actually remembers a sign similar to this one outside her hometown. She said it was the biggest KKK sign she has ever seen, right outside Lillington, North Carolina. And so her father raised her to believe that they were equal to whites, didn't want her to have an inferiority complex. Clearly, not everybody felt the same way as her father about Blacks being equal to whites. In fact, one day her father got uppity at a town hall and started making suggestions. And that night, the KKK burned a cross in their front yard. Next slide. Later on in her life, Miss Reddick went to Hampton, which is an HBCU in Virginia, and she went there for 3 years, majored in chemistry and math. She was actually accepted at Duke for her undergrad, but she was ultimately turned away because they did not have a place to house her. And this is how she described her original interest in pharmacy. And we'll play this video clip.
Why did you choose pharmacy? Oh, I was doing housework one summer at a Jewish family's home, and the lady of the house had a cocktail party, a dinner. Actually, it was a dinner. And I was encouraged by some of her guests. It was an integrated party, which had at least one civil rights leader, but the rest of them were executives from CBS, ABC, and NBC. Who was the top menus? This is some real high level stuff. But one of them called me aside after she had talked so much about me and told me, why didn't I use my chemistry and math in a more practical situation? Why didn't I study pharmacy? And that dawned on me. I said, well, I'm going to take the test again to make my grade on the test high enough to get into pharmacy school. And so after that third year of college, I was accepted in UNC at pharmacy school.
And she decided on UNC because her father learned that they were integrating the school. So here's another clip of how she learned that.
Well, I was really pleased. It was an ambition of my dad to integrate school itself. And I remembered sitting at the table around dinner. He said they will accept Blacks now. He gave reasons. And he said, who's going to go? So my older sister said, not I. I will think about it. My second sister said, not me. I can't stand to be away from my friends. They looked at me and said, that leaves you, Lorna. I said, oh no. I said, Daddy, you think I can go up there and do all that hard work? He said, yeah. I said, you think I got it in me? He said, yes. I was surprised. I thought, I was very pleased that he had all that confidence in me. And so those things ran through my mind as the first, that it would be a challenge.
Contrary to Mr. Wicker's experience, Ms. Reddick was actually welcomed and invited. In a meeting she had with President Friday, as in the William and Ida Friday Center down on 54, President Friday said that Ms. Reddick was just the type of person we wanted to see integrate the school, and that they had no social reason for accepting her. Now, I think that this is in line with the politics of respectability, where Black history is curated and censored to showcase Blacks who more closely resemble white culture or who are seen as role models for other Blacks to emulate. But that's how I analyze this statement. These and this next video clip are what Miss Reddick said about her warm welcome from the dean of the pharmacy school.
When I first came to UNC, the dean scheduled an appointment with me to come to the building at 11 a.m. So much to my surprise, there were not police cars or marshals or people trying to protect the crowd, but there was a long sidewalk up to Beard Hall. It was Beard Hall then. And I walked from the sidewalk to the front door. This is what happened. The whole student body was lined up on both sides of the sidewalk. And I walked it alone, and they were friendly. And when I got to the door, the dean opened it and said, "Welcome to the School of Pharmacy. I want you to remember that you are the first." And we had a little discussion inside the building, and that was it. But that was important to me. It was a complete surprise. So he did say, "You're welcome." And I thanked him for introducing himself that way and for having the student body recognize me and know who I was in the pharmacy school. And
Interestingly, this dean told her that she was the first, even though now we know that she wasn't. Mr. Wicker was the first. And there is some historical gray area here, because this could have been Dean Brecht who gave Wicker the cold shoulder, or it could have been the new Dean Hager who started Aesop's rise to the top, the new Dean Hager that Mr. Wicker says where the school changed a complete 180. And the years and the patterns in their behavior between this few years right here makes it a little unclear. So we have some more digging to do into that. But as far as interactions with her classmates, Ms. Reddick was well liked. She got along with people. Her lead professor asked KE to let her join the group. And so Ms. Reddick did. She joined KE and she often studied with the other girls. She also was studying so much that she missed the Hallmark lunch counter sit-ins that were going on in Greensboro and Chapel Hill. But she actually doesn't mind so much that she missed out. There is one, quote, little difficulty that she had where a professor graded her unfairly. And that professor said that it was a favor to her to condition her for an inevitably hard life that she would face post-graduation. But overall, her experiences at the school were quite positive. Next slide. As far as interactions at Big UNC, still things were good. She considers herself to be a proud Tar Heel. She went to tons of sporting events and gatherings, and she had friends, both Black and white, all through campus. She never personally experienced any of the run-ins that Wicker and some of the other students saw where Black students were being targeted by white students. There was, however, something strange that happened at her graduation that was uncharacteristic compared to the warm welcome she got on her first day. The dean, likely Dean Hager, asked her to come later than everybody else to pick up her diploma. He told her not to stand in a big long line to pick it up, but to come by later when almost everybody was gone. This wasn't at the actual graduation, like cap and gown, where they just hand you like a sheet of paper, but this was later on where you come to a field and pick up your real diploma. So that was a little bit strange way to end her tenure at the School of Pharmacy. But according to this quote here, she didn't mind that very much either. So next slide, if you remember Miss Wicker's summer work with the New England family, the husband of that family was chairman of the board of trustees at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. So to begin her pharmacy career post-graduation, everybody after their 5-year undergrad degree went to do a 1-year internship before they could become licensed. Her internship was the first pharmacy internship, she says, at the Mount Sinai Hospital. That position did not exist until she went with this man to the administrative office to create it. Unfortunately, that did not sit well with the NC Board of Pharmacy. And so here is a video clip of what she says happened.
Now, when I was working at Mount Sinai, one little thing happened that I questioned. Um, Two men came in. I was filling a prescription, working in compounding, which was a separate little area. But I could see the main counter from where I was. These two men came in, spoke with him, and then he brought them back to me. These men are from North Carolina. They are FBI agents sent by the Board of Pharmacy of North Carolina. They wanted to authenticate that you were here, and that you had the right papers, and you were where you said you were. You sent your information into the board. And actually, I answered whatever questions they had. How long have you been here? What are your duties? That type of thing. And it jived with what they were told or what I had filled out in the paper. But my boss said, this has never happened to us. Nobody has checked this far into internships, or whether I was the first intern, but anything. The Black people were office people. There were Black people there. There were no Black pharmacists. They matched their picture of me with me and were on their way.
So after part of her internship at Mount Sinai, she had additional community pharmacy experiences in Washington, D.C., while her husband was stationed at Walter Reed there. And then she came back to North Carolina and she worked at NC Memorial Hospital Pharmacy Department, which is, of course, part of UNC Health down the road on Manning Drive. And while she was there, that is when they were starting to revamp the pharmacy. They got a new building, a new office. They added clinical services. They started sterile compounding during her tenure as well. She was also the first woman, she says, at NC Memorial to be granted maternity leave. Normally, when women were starting a family, they didn't come back. She did. But she was ultimately denied promotion into a leadership role. So instead, she accepted an instructorship at the School of Pharmacy. And she became director of our drug abuse program. And she also joined the health professions recruitment team, who went out to HBCUs in North Carolina to get more and recruit more Black talent. Shortly after this, then she retired to stay home and raise her two daughters. Next slide. So these are the stories of our first two Black graduates from the UNC School of Pharmacy. And after they share their stories with us, we asked them a couple of questions. How has being Black impacted your career? And what improvements do you want to see at ESOP? And these were their answers. Dr. Eric, for Mr. Wicker?
So for Mr. Wicker, he started out by saying, I don't know if being Black has impacted my career that much. And then he sort of went into a series of vignettes where he talked about interactions with customers, which certainly seemed to be either probably racist or certainly racist. But he overall is very positive about pharmacy in his career, and has had a long and fulfilling, by his own words, career in pharmacy.
For Ms. Reddick, she said that she expressed a familiar double standard, that as Black people, we know that we are not allowed to make the same mistakes as majority individuals. For her, this feeling pushed her into excellence to do more and to try more.
And so we asked him about what improvements they want to see for the School of Pharmacy. Mr. Wicker was really said that seems like the School of Pharmacy is soaring, and really enjoyed the marketing materials that he gets from the school and the idea that the school is doing so well. He's a very, very proud Tar Heel alum.
For Ms. Wicker, much like the rest of our Black History Month panels that we saw, she wants to see more innovative courses at the school. She herself furthered her education after graduation by taking biopharmaceutics courses and cancer therapeutics courses, some of which were at the School of Medicine. She almost pursued a PhD in pharmacology. She wants to see our faculty and staff at the top of their game. She also wants us to keep our alumni in the loop about what's going on at the school. We mostly communicate through email these days, but she loves letters. So if the school wants to send her a letter, she'd love that.
And so talking about future directions, where would we like to take this project? Well, first of all, if there's anybody who wants to help with any of these interviews, we would love that. That would be great. Christian has been phenomenal in this, and she has been a great interviewer. It was Christian who was asking all the questions with this, and it was wonderful to have a current student who could connect so well. There's opportunity to cultivate additional alumni relationships with additional early Black graduates of the school. And gather more resources, and stories for these. And really, I see this as a faculty member as being core to current efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion. From a historical perspective, I mean, it's always my thought that you can't really understand where you're going or problems today if you don't understand, the origins of those problems and what is kind of led up to today. So if we look at trying to get additional, Black students to enroll on campus, we have to understand as a school, both kind of culturally, historically, the relationships between, Blacks and whites. I mean, frankly, and then, we also had to understand what we as a school have done and not done to sort of lead us to today. And so it's my hope that through the collecting of these stories and reflecting upon them, and then, making these stories more known to the UNC, family, that we can, improve our efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
For me, I would love to as well see this project expand our inclusive mentorship initiative. Mr. Wicker noted in his interview that Black kids don't know they can be pharmacists because they've never seen a Black pharmacist. And representation is still important when Black kids get to pharmacy school and beyond. And so I hope that these stories and stories from other BIPOC alumni, faculty, staff, and students hold us accountable to our strategic plan and hold us accountable to each other. These stories, they teach us to celebrate our differences while we work toward a common goal, and they really need to be told and listened to. So thank you all for listening. This concludes our presentation on the history and the background, and we hope that you learned in this presentation, that you were challenged by what was said here tonight, and we'll open it up for discussion.
So I have some questions in the chat. So how has this work learning about like the segregation of UNC affected your outlook on UNC and like schools in the South?
Greg, you can take it. I see it.
I come at this history. I'm a trained historian. I don't have a pharmacy background per se. So I come at this history knowing this history as it applies to other aspects of American culture and higher education. And so to me, this history has not been surprising to learn. Pharmacy was just like other types of higher education throughout the South, that they were segregated. They were very resistant to change. Some schools did a better job than others. Most schools didn't do a very good job. To me, I think as Ben was saying, the use of these stories is to push us to do better, figure out, like, as I say in my presentation, Mercer in the 60s, the Southern School of Pharmacy did a great job of trying to change the culture of the school. And I think we can use these stories to try to change the culture of institutions even today, to make them more inclusive, to make them more welcoming, to strive towards integration as opposed to desegregation, or inclusion as opposed to diversity, as Christian eloquently said. So I think I see it as an opportunity for all schools, and this is not to indict Southern schools of pharmacy. University of Wisconsin graduated its first African-American student in 1920. As far as I can tell, the second African-American graduate from the University of Wisconsin School of Pharmacy was 1943 and then 1960. So Northern schools don't have a clean bill of health in this regard. So all schools of pharmacy can learn from this history and try to use it to be better in the future, in the present and the future.
Thank you for that.
So, I can speak to this a little bit, and then Christian, I'd love to hear, your thoughts. So, I mean, I listen to these stories, and we have, there's a Southern Oral History Project at UNC campus. James Barnes has contributed to that, and I've read that, and I've reflected on Mr. Wicker's story as well. And James Barnes talks about, wanting to come to UNC because it was the most liberal place in the state. And so we have to understand the historical context that surrounds this, where even in the Hocutt case, the Hocutt case talked about the white liberals in Chapel Hill, and the white liberal perspective was, it's going to happen, but let's not have it happen too fast. I mean, that was the progressive attitude in the 1930s. Think about what we talked about with the Wilmington insurrection. So it really is, we have to place this in historical context and understand what was happening at the time. At the same time, these stories, I think, are powerful examples of people who had the courage and the perseverance, and it gives me incredible respect for the actions of these early students and all who have followed them, coming into what is still a predominantly white institution and excelling.
Thank
For
you, Dr.
me, oh, sorry.
I was just saying thank you, Dr. Urick. Go ahead, Christian.
For me, I think it really became real. Their experiences really became real, not when we were gathering background information, putting our questions together, figuring out what we wanted to ask these people. For me, it became real when we got on Zoom with Ms. Reddick and her daughter, and we sent them the questions ahead of time. They had talked between each other for a solid week, getting her answers together because her memory is not where it used to be. And so just hearing Kathy, her daughter, say, wow, my mom did all of this and I had no idea. And then Miss Reddick follows up, oh, I was just going to school. Mr. Wicker follows up, I was just going to school. This is where I wanted to be. I want to be a pharmacist. And so that challenges me to do what they're doing, as in keep going, be a pharmacist, but also just to build up those around me and invite everyone into the conversation, because that isolation is real. And it's not just them, it's with Black people in our school in all the categories, faculty, staff, student. And so that's what I'm taking from this, just to invite everybody into the conversation, Black, white, anything else.
Definitely agree. Thank you for that. So we do have another question in the chat. How do y'all feel about the recent history with UNC, particularly Silent Sam or the Dixie? What are your thoughts on that?
I thought it was, I guess these aren't my thoughts, but I thought it was particularly interesting when we were talking to Mr. Wicker. He told us, so a couple Christmases ago, he was hanging out with his family and his family was telling him, oh, have you heard about this Southern racist school down South? And they did this and they have this Confederate monument and they're going to tear it down. And he was like, oh, where was that? And they said it was UNC Chapel Hill. And he said, UNC? That was the most liberal school around back in the day. That's where I went to school. And he told us that to them at the time, Silent Sam was a joke. You would walk by, and it's a little bit of a crude joke, but you would take your date by, and if Silent Sam shot his gun, then your date was a chase woman. And if he didn't, then she wasn't. That's what they thought about Silent Sam. Ms. Reddick, she didn't mind. She went to all the football games. She didn't care. She just made friends with everybody and had fun. Jimmy Barnes, however, was offended with the whole thing, packed his bags, he was ready to go. So for me, just hearing their three very different perspectives from our three firsts, and me not coming from North Carolina, really knowing what was going on until I got here when they were already tearing it down. It was interesting. I still have my trying to get my thoughts together about all this.
And Christian, on the note of getting thoughts together, we're getting some things in the chat about reflections, and I would love for anybody else that has any reflections on this, if just not even questions, just how does this make you feel? I mean, I certainly felt that it was, I cried during both interviews. I did. We cut me out of those, but so I certainly found this to be moving. So for anybody else, how has this affected you?
I guess I'll share. So honestly, the fact that Mr. Wicker is still alive and working is the thing that really shook me to my core, especially during the planning of these events, because when we were initially talking about planning to speak to the first Black students, I'm thinking, okay, these are going to be like incredibly old people who can't share their opinions, like, but these people are very real. They're still very close to us. And it just shows that although it seems as if racism and Black history is so far away, it's still very near and dear to us. And it kind of explains some of the things that are happening in the day-to-day lives of students now. So because it wasn't that far away, some of these experiences can be directly related to students in the program now. So honestly, I'm just shocked that these people are still alive and still able to share their stories.
Same thing, like just piggybacking off of Jasmine and seeing like some of the photos of like, especially the photo of the KKK walking down the street beside two Black people. That photo really, really like got to me. It hit me because that was not that long ago. I believe the photo was dated in 1964 and my father was born in 1960. So it really shows like segregation is not that far. We're not that far away removed from it. So it just makes like, just want to keep that in mind, like in our profession as well. We do have another question in the chat. How can we incorporate the history of our school into our curriculum and allow students to face our past and how it still impacts us?
So I would like to love to tackle that. So you know, as the faculty member who teaches the history of pharmacy lecture to the incoming P1 students, you know, and I guess, you know, obviously, you know, history is very important to me, and I would love to see this, you know, exactly finding the right course, finding, you know, how does this content balance against other content, and I think no pharmacy student would tell you that they don't, you know, learn enough or have enough classes. So it's always trying to, you know, find how do you work with this content and other content which students have. But I would love to see this, you know, added in the course. You know, I don't know exactly what course it would be. I would love to work with others in the school to make that happen. You know, we can certainly, as we expand our interviews with the graduates, you know, I mean, there are a lot of stories out there, and we can make something like this, you know, let's say call it annual, something like that, where we can, you know, share these experiences. And then beyond the incorporation into the curriculum, which is of course essential, you know, I think that there are ways in which this could be incorporated into the school itself. You know, there are a lot of faces, and in the first floor of Beard Hall, a lot of those faces are faces that look somewhat like me. And so, you know, we have stories from people who, and powerful stories from people whose experiences, some of whom we shared here. And I think we can incorporate that in a meaningful way. Of course, finding exactly how to do that is a process which is far beyond me as a lowly assistant professor. But I think that there are meaningful opportunities to incorporate this, you know, as a session in the curriculum, and then thinking beyond the curriculum as well.
I'll echo both of those points, Ben. Those are both great points. In terms of the curriculum, what we're trying to do, AIHP, American Institute of Pharmacy, is located at the UW-Madison School of Pharmacy, as we mentioned earlier. And what we're trying to do now is to spread history throughout the curriculum. So there's not necessarily there is a history class, but history doesn't need to be siloed its own class, because as we're talking about today, this history is recent history. It informs the present in a very real way. And there are ways to spread the history of pharmacy writ large throughout the curriculum. For this particular topic, I think AACP's lack of interest in dealing with the subject could be introduced in a pharmacy ethics class or something like that. And there are ways, I think, to distribute history across the curriculum so it's not just in one unit. It can be addressed throughout different classes as topics come up, whether it's this particular history or history of prescription drugs, history of legal drugs or illegal drugs. There are ways to incorporate history, but also the built environment, as Ben was talking about, is very important to let students see themselves reflected throughout the school. As Mr. Wicker said, Black students come to him, I don't see Black pharmacists. Let people come into the school, see that pharmacists are all types of people. And just to improve the built environment in a diverse way, like Ben was talking about, I think is also an important step.
Thank you for that. So we have another question in the chat. How do you feel that the school can use information learned from this exploration of history and potentially experiences of current students to actively work towards becoming, quote, inclusive, unquote?
That's a tough one. So it's really easy to just say, hey, we're not there yet, and not offer suggestions. And we're still thinking. There's a lot of still processing, still thinking. But I think just what Mr. Wicker was saying about how students wouldn't even speak to him, didn't know who he was, thought they had a new student. The video that Dr. Bond showed about the first Black student at Georgia just turning away and not even acknowledging that he was there. My some odd great grandmother used to say, it don't cost you nothing to smile. And it certainly doesn't cost that much to speak to somebody. So even just saying hello, like, and that's basic level. That's not even school level. One student say hello to another. One professor say hello to somebody that doesn't look like you. You're going to have to look for them, but just speaking to somebody goes a long way, even if it's only the first step.
And I'll pick up on what Christian was saying there. This is not the three of us. This is not just the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. This is the school as a community and as a culture and as an environment. Recognizing these stories, recognizing the need for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know that gets overused, but those words are powerful words, and it requires the school to come together as a community to support these goals. And we have a lot of people on this call, which is excellent, and we need more, and we need for us to work together to achieve this.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm reading the comments in the chat to see if there are questions. And very appreciative of y'all reflecting on your experience or reflecting on your thoughts from the presentation, like what you want to see from the school. We really appreciate that.
I'd just like to thank Sissy and Jasmine and everyone else for including me in this event and organizing this excellent series. It's, as we're talking about, this history is so important, these topics are so important, and it's great that you're starting this conversation at the School of Pharmacy at UNC. It's really great work. You should be commended and feel proud of what you've done.
And Greg, I'll thank you for the excellent presentation. Like I said, if it wasn't for your presentation at the International Congress of the History of Pharmacy and our conversation around that, this wouldn't have happened. So thank you for your excellent foundational scholarship that really set this up well. And of course, thank you for, to Dean Gashuba and to the entire advancement team, Annie and the rest for supporting this work and our alumni engagement. And of course, Dean White as well for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Really, I look forward to seeing where this goes. And then finally, big thanks to Christian for this. I mean, really, if not for Christian, none of this would have worked. So really huge thanks to Christian for all of this work.
Yeah, this has been a really awesome teamwork effort, and I can't wait to see where it goes with even more people groups.
With that being said, we are at 6:30, so we can go ahead and wrap up. We just want to thank y'all so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Urick, Dr. Bond, and Christian for the presentation. The interview is very informative. I want to thank all of y'all for participating in this event and also our other two events for the Black Excellence in Celebration for Black History Month. This is very special for UNC because it's the first time we are celebrating, and we really hope to continue that throughout the years, and also really looking forward to see what you guys do in your research and your interviews as well. So with that being said, we thank y'all for attending, and y'all have a great night.